Well, for the end of the semester, this is a damn good audience, so welcome. I'm thrilled to have everyone here. I'm John Stack. I'm the founding dean of the Stephen J. Green School of International and Public Affairs. I'm honored to be here for such an important, timely, and significant presentation of our flagship series, the Dorothy Green Lecture Series. William Butler Yeats once said that education is not the filling of a pail, but the lighting of a fire. Today we are lighting a fire by shedding light on a pivotal moment in U.S. history, a moment in which thousands of families have faced immeasurable pain and despair as they flee to our borders in search of a better life. Instead, what they have found in many cases is tremendous suffering brought on by a now-ended family separation policy that has left thousands upon thousands of young children separated from their parents and detained in sometimes just deplorable conditions. With us today is a distinguished group of experts and practitioners who will lead a conversation on the very impact these policies have on families and indeed on entire communities. They will share with us the findings of a recent report by the Americans for Immigrant Justice entitled Family Separations, Broken Systems, Broken Families. And that's what this report details, that broken systems and broken families, those systems, have created. The report includes a lot of facts and figures on the crisis, but for me, the most importantly are the voices of parents and children who have been so deeply affected by this policy, as well as the voices of the dedicated attorneys and advocates who have struggled to defend these children in court. In a few minutes, you will hear from Cheryl Little, the co-founder and executive director of Americans for Immigrant Justice and one of the nation's leading experts on this issue. Cheryl, thank you for choosing to present these findings here at the Green School. I have to tell you, Cheryl's been a hero of mine for years. I'm proud to say she's an alumna of the Green School, of our give her, that's worthy of applause. Of our Criminal Justice Department, which I have to tell you is doing such wonderful work in looking at prosecutorial strategies. They have a major grant from the MacArthur Foundation that's going to be renewed, and they're looking at state attorneys' offices in 4 major cities in the United States. Cheryl, we're really delighted to have you here for this conversation. I also want to thank the rest of our panelists, Michelle Marie Ortiz, Deputy Director of AI Justice, Martha Vallejo, a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist with expertise in the effects of trauma on adolescents and adults. And lastly, but certainly not least, is Juan Carlos Gomez. Let me get his full name. Juan was my student in the 1980s, the early 1980s. Yes, I've been here forever. He was just a fabulous student. He went on to Columbia. Penn, okay, that's good. The president would approve. He went on to, yes, I know. He went on to Penn, did wonderful work, but most of all, Juan, as a faculty member in the law school, what Juan does is extraordinary. His commitment to defending and working with immigrants has been so exemplary, and I'm just thrilled to be here. I want to thank our other sponsors, the College of Law, and to the Americans for Immigrant Justice. And so without further palaver from me, welcome Cheryl Little.
Thank you so much, Dean Stack. You're one of my heroes. When I went to FIU, there were like 5 buildings. We all knew each other. And I got lost today looking for the parking lot. Okay? So it's exciting. It's wonderful. Congratulations to all of you who are now attending this wonderful university. And, you know, the Stephen Green School of International and Public Affairs is something that I just think it's a landmark in terms of what's being accomplished. In fact, my executive assistant, Katie Acosta, graduated from here. There she is.
All right,
And I've known Ambassador Green and his wife, Dorothea, for a very long time. They've been longtime supporters of immigrants' rights. Dr. Kim Green has been on our board for many, many years. They're always there when we need them. And, you know, they were here for you too, so that's who they are. I don't want to spend a lot of time introducing our panelists because it's more important for them to share their expertise with you, but I'll just say Jennifer's not here, the director of our program, and there's a good reason. She gave birth to a healthy baby girl last week. But Michelle is a brilliant attorney. She's our deputy director. She's had years of experience assisting survivors of domestic violence and human trafficking. She's considered a leading expert in the nation with respect to these issues. She supervises all our legal programs, and she has her finger in the pulse of what's happening with children who've been separated from their parents, and will add a lot to this panel. Martha Vallejo I've known for a number of years as well. And as the dean said, she's a licensed clinical social worker and psychotherapist. She is an expert in terms of trauma counseling for children and adults, not just here in the United States, but abroad as well. She's won many awards, too many to count, but most importantly, for 14 years, Martha has provided trauma counseling to our kids and our staff, and that is priceless. Juan Gomez. Now, what can I say about Juan Gomez? Right. So Juan has been fighting the good fight for over 25 years. He's helped literally thousands of immigrants fight their removal. He's represented refugees from all over the world. But most importantly, he used to be with us when we were the Florida Immigrant Advocacy Center, FIAC. And so our loss is FIU's gain. And I will tell you, there's something we talk about all the time, and that is, does he really ever sleep? Because he's always working. I don't know how he does it. There's got to be something going on that we don't know about Juan, but anyway. But I'm going to give you just a little background before we turn to our panelists. So for over 20 years, we at AI Justice have had the privilege of providing free legal help to children who arrive here alone, seeking safety and a better life. We've heard countless horrific stories over the years, but nothing prepared us for the issue of family separation. The fact that babies would be torn from their mother's arms, nothing prepared us for that. And while the border was sort of the epicenter in terms of the media when family separation sort of hit the news, that's where children are processed. There are over 100 shelters that children are then sent to throughout the country, and some of them were right here in our backyard. We're the only agency that's authorized to provide free legal help to immigrants in these shelters, and we've been doing that for a long time. And we started seeing separated families in the summer of 2017, when nobody was talking about family separation. In July, we were representing a 3-year-old girl who'd been separated from her dad. And then we represented 8-year-old Jesus, who'd been separated in the summer of 2017. These families are separated whether they enter legally or not. Many of these families entered legally. And most of the families we see, most of the children we see, look for Border Patrol agents to help them. So it was in April or May that our government announced the zero tolerance policy. And what that was we're going to criminally charge you if you don't enter at a legal port of entry. So what happened? So people would plead guilty. A couple of days later, they'd be released. They'd pay a fine. It's a misdemeanor. But the real punishment, not knowing if you're ever going to see your child again. This is a misdemeanor. And this is the price that these families have paid. The federal magistrate in Brownsville, who was hearing these cases when people during a cattle call were pleading guilty to the misdemeanor charge, said, if there's a hell, this is probably what it looks like. And shockingly, there was no plan for reunification. Think about that. No plan for reunification. We're separating you from your child, the child from the parent, and you may never know how to find them. It was only after the ACLU filed a lawsuit that the government ordered, that the judge ordered our government to make sure that children would be reunified with their parents. But it didn't include parents who'd already been deported. And we represented many children whose parents had already been deported. It didn't include families who'd been picked up before the zero tolerance policy was announced and deported. We wrote our report to give these kids a voice and to describe the challenges that staff face in trying to help children, some as young as 2 years old, and to continue helping these children with their fight for justice, because it's not over. The last thing I'll say is our Miami Immigration Court covers, is it 7 or 8 counties, Michelle? 8 counties, and our staff, so these children live all over the southern part here of Florida, and our staff travel to meet with these children and help prepare their cases. So now I'm going to move. And the most important part of this is getting the panel to answer our questions. So Michelle, I'm starting with you. So we've been working with unaccompanied children for over 20 years. We've heard all kinds of stories of trauma. How did the population change when family separation went into effect? And how difficult was it for our staff to adjust to that? And how difficult was it and is it to win cases for children who have very compelling reasons to legitimately get relief here?
So we saw a dramatic shift in the population after the family separation policy started. For 20 years, we were well-trained and experienced in working with mostly teenagers who had suffered horrific trauma in the home country, but who were now in a safe, secure environment in a shelter. And most of these children that we've worked with over all of these years were between the ages of 12 and 17. Occasionally, we would have a small child, but that child typically came with an older sibling who was also at the shelter. And so for the first time, we were seeing children who not only had they most likely suffered trauma back in the home country, but they were experiencing perhaps the most traumatic event of their lives before our eyes. They were in the middle of crisis, right? They were not in a safe, secure environment. They were lost and scared and afraid. And in addition to that, they were younger and younger than we had ever been accustomed to. So we were dealing with children in diapers, a lot of 6, 7, and 8-year-olds, many children, most of whom who could not tell us their parents' full name, could not tell us even the first name, right? You'd ask, what is your mom's name? And they'd say, Mommy, right? What is your last name? They didn't know. Early on, the 3-year-olds you mentioned, she didn't know where she was from. She couldn't answer that question. She didn't know the names of any of her family members. All she could answer was when we asked, how old are you? She would hold up her little 3 fingers to tell us that she was 3. And that child, we later learned, had been separated from her father at the border. He was deported, and her mother was deceased. Her mother passed away as she and her father had made the journey to the United States. So our staff were dealing with really young children in the midst of a really horrible crisis for these children, where the questions we were used to getting were, when is my hearing? Am I going to be released from the shelter? Do I have to speak when I get before the judge? And now the only questions we were asked were, where's my mom? Where's my dad? They'd see our cell phones on the desk and say, can you call my mom? I haven't spoken to my mom in 6 weeks, in 2 months, whatever it was. And so it was an entirely different shift in communication and conversation, and really challenging for staff. So many years of experience, and we're so well trained to deal with a particular population, and we're facing something really unprecedented. So one of the first things we had to do was figure out, okay, we have a duty to these children to explain to them where they are, what's happening, what their rights are, and what that process would be for them. And we usually had done it as, little group presentations where we interact with the children and we do mock hearings and explain all of these things to them, but these children were way too small for that. So our shelter advocates, who are amazing human beings, had the idea of preparing a coloring book as a way to interact with these children and explain to these children what was going on and also get information from these children. So this coloring book was written by our staff and drawn by an artist who donated his time and his talent. And it tells the story of a boy named Oscar from Guatemala, and it's in his voice. And on the previous screen, can we go back? So it says, I came to the United States 3 months ago. I crossed all of Mexico to get to the border. I was on a bus, on a truck, and I walked a lot to be able to get here. And so there you see Oscar, and he says, how about you? What did you use for transportation to get to the border? Color or circle how you got here, right? And so the children could identify with Oscar and also with each other as they're filling out this coloring book. And for the lawyers, we could learn, did this child come on a plane? Where are their documents? Did this child come walking on a train? And try to gather as much information as we could from these children. And if you move on, it also explains what the process is. There's laws in the United States that say that you have to have permission to enter, right? And so you saw a guard. What did the guard ask you? What did you tell the guard? Did you have documents with you? And then this explains that there are laws in the United States, and the laws may be different from where they're from. And that there will be a lawyer with them to help them navigate these laws, and that the lawyers are the ones that understand the laws and will defend them through this process. And this is the judge, and it just explains more about the importance of going to court and not missing court, and that there will be a judge there who's going to decide their case moving forward.
So a lot of these children also, they were telling staff that they'd seen dead bodies in the streets, that they were afraid to go to school because the vicious gangs were waiting outside to recruit them. What were they told, Michelle, about the family separation? Did they have any idea what was happening?
So the children reported that they were never given information. In fact, many of them, when they were initially held at the border by Customs and Border Protection, they were held in perreras, which are the kennel-looking fences, or in hieleras, which are very cold holding cells. And many of them reported that an officer would come and tell them it's time to go take a bath, and they'd leave with the officer expecting to see their parent immediately after the bath and never saw their parent again. And unfortunately, one of the really big problems was we were, forcibly one government agency was forcibly separating these children, right? So it was Customs and Border Protection and ICE separating these children, and then the children were handed over to the Office of Refugee Resettlement, who's charged with the care and custody of unaccompanied minors. But no information was given to the Office of Refugee Resettlement. So our caseworkers and those working at the shelters couldn't help the children and couldn't provide information to the children or any comfort in terms of when they'll see their parent again or where their parent even is, because the other government agencies did not share any of that information. And what we found out later was they didn't share that information because they never recorded it, right? They never recorded this child belongs to this parent, and this parent is going to be at this location, and this child is going to be at this shelter. There was absolutely no record of the instance of separation and that had been a family unit and they belonged to each other.
And also one thing I would add, and then Martha, the next question is for you, is that many of these children speak indigenous languages. And so many of them didn't even speak Spanish. So the confusion, the level of fear was even greater in many of these cases. So Martha, the former president of the American Academy of Pediatrics has said that family separation is tantamount to child abuse. Do you agree with that? And how has the separation of families impacted children, both short-term and long-term?
Well, first of all, thank you to FIAC and Michelle and Cheryl for this opportunity. I'm really very happy and very grateful for the time we have worked together and all what I have learned from them. The American Academy of Pediatrics, it's right about what they say, and it's based on research about brain development and the impact of adversity in children. Children, their physiology and their brain is developing. And it's within this period of time that most adversity, that most children, all these children, as Michelle has said, are adolescents and young children. And the worst of it is that the younger the child, the more adversity or the highest the impact in their lifelong health and mental health. It's not only that they are going to have depression. To say only because people say, okay, if they have depression, we will give them some therapy or some medicine and that will be over. No, it's an impact in their health. So this is based on a study from the 90s. So the research has been gone on for years. But unfortunately, as this same Academy of Pediatricians say that only 4% of physicians are informed or do adverse childhood experiences assessment when they treat a child for different issues. Asthma, eczema, pneumonia, depressed immunological system. But based on this study, it says that the likelihood of experiencing adversity, the highest the probability or the highest adversity, and they relate a lot of adversities. One is community violence, the other is interfamiliar or interpartner violence, which most of these kids are escaping from community violence, from threats where they have been seen, when they have seen dead bodies, when they have seen their parents being killed, or their mother being persecuted, or a lot of this. So the highest all these events, the highest that they will suffer from health issues and that they will be sick from viral sickness or different illness, whatever you think about a child being sick. So unfortunately, there are some services in San Francisco Bayview where they assessed for adversity in order to create interdisciplinary groups to educate the impact of that stressful experiences. I will really recommend for all of us that are interested, it's evident that you're interested in the topic because you're here, to listen to, for example, there is a YouTube where a pediatrician, Nadine Burkhardt, who has also wrote a book. It's called The Deepest Well. And that book is each chapter narrates the story of her services to one of these kids that have difficulty thriving, difficulty growing. It affects also everything inside their bodies. Why? When trauma comes or hits these kids, who, according to the trauma research, they have suffered triple paradigm trauma. That means in their countries, through the journey, and now here. So the cortisol, which is there in our brains to be released if we need to defend ourselves or escapes, it's flooding their brains. And at the same time, irregular amounts of adrenaline keep going on all the time in ways that cannot be controlled and affect what? Besides what I have said, the health, the endocrinology system, their brains, their frontal cortex. Frontal cortex is the place in our brains that controls impulsivity, that controls or that monitors our capacity to learn. And what are we having here? And I have seen in some of my clients, they take the kid to a doctor because he cannot regulate their emotion, he cannot pay attention, he cannot learn more. The mother, who is a very committed mother, takes to the doctor and they prescribe or misdiagnose them with ADD or ADHD, attention deficit disorder. When I talked to this kid who was cutting himself because the mom found out, was cutting himself because the mom was in deportation proceedings, and he was 12 years old and part of a family, a very caring mother, he said, I cannot live with that drug. That drugs make my eyes blink all the time, and I feel like a zombie. So what do I do with a child like that? Okay, acknowledge what is happening to that kid and tell him, there's nothing wrong with you. It's the system, it's the world around you that is hitting you in a ways that bodies cannot deal with that. Just that phrase make the kid feel more safe, and working with the mother in order to calm herself and understand that her stress level will affect their child. So what does Nadine Burkhardt says about what to do in order to heal these kids? Remove the stress, the environmental things that are happening to the kid, and help the parent to enhance their capacity to be a real buffering to all this situation, a real caring, giving a hug to a kid in moments of stress. And most of these kids are being separated, they don't have a hug, and at the shelters they can hug them, as far as I know. So it releases oxytocin, and the child create a bond and feel protected and feel with better situation or more equipped to deal with the situation.
Thank you, Martha. Michelle, I'm going to go back to you for a minute because you started talking a little bit about how the system was not in place to reunify these families. Can you just tell us a little bit more about the extent to which you and the rest of our staff who were working in these cases struggled to try to reunify the children we were representing whose parents were somewhere, but they weren't anywhere where we knew how to contact them?
Yeah, and it was the only way to describe it, I think, was utter chaos, because we're used to working within systems and institutions and navigating documents and sources of information that just didn't exist when we were trying to find parents. So we had at some point over 200 children that we were providing services to that had been separated from a parent. And many of these children couldn't tell us who their parents were, as I mentioned before. Some could. And so we try to find them in the online ICE detainer system, and sometimes they would be there, and many times they weren't, and we didn't know why. Did we get the name wrong? Did the child get the name wrong? We later learned that many of them had been deported, and so they were not in the detainer locator system. But we were not the only ones dealing with this issue. There were other agencies across the country working with separated parents and separated children, and we unified together. And we had a joint spreadsheet where we could go in and put in all the information that we had about a child, their age, and their location, as much information as we could about the parent, hoping that someone else had gone in there and said, hey, I know the father. The father is in Washington State and detained at this facility, and tried to connect in that way. We also made cold calls to a ton of detention centers, which was also really challenging because they won't tell you a lot of information, and they don't, the people who have any information don't work at night or on the weekends. And things were moving really quickly. But it was extraordinarily chaotic, and we were unable to find a lot of parents because so many of them had been deported. At the same time that we were navigating those issues and trying to locate parents, we were also dealing with family members who were living in the United States and who had located these children, knew where these children were, and wanted to sponsor these children, right? So some of them were even their parents. We had a few children where one parent was already living in the United States, but they had come to the United States with the other parent, and the other parent was detained. And so let's say mom is trying to get that child out of the shelter and have that child released to her. The government wouldn't allow them to do it without the consent of the separated father, right? But we can't locate the separated father. And it was literally an around-the-clock, all hands on deck by all of our children's legal program to try to locate these parents. And if they did have a sponsor, like a parent or an aunt, we'd try to communicate with that detained parent and say, what do you want for this child? Do you want this child to be released to this other family member or to their mother? And try to have these conversations. And oftentimes what it really took was just, even on Facebook, in our immigration groups, immigration lawyer groups, we'd say, does anyone work near this detention center? Private message me, and then we'd make arrangements with a random attorney that we had never met before, that we'd send the documents to, and they would go out of their way to the adult detention center to find this parent and have them sign a consent form, send it back to us so that the child could be released to their parent or other sponsor here.
And I'll just add a couple of things. I'll give you one example of a child. This was a young boy who was at one of the facilities here, and he was told he was going to be sent to Texas to be reunited with his dad. And they transferred him to Texas, and it's 8 o'clock in the morning the next day, and he's waiting to be reunited with the dad. It's 9 o'clock at night. He hasn't seen his dad. He doesn't know what's going on. Next morning, 6 o'clock, he's there waiting to see his dad. Nothing happens. It's 9, 10 o'clock at night. Guess what? They bring him back to the shelter here in Miami. They didn't reunite him with his father. They didn't tell him why he wasn't being reunited with his dad. Long story short, at some point the dad, and this happened routinely, was told to sign some papers if he wanted to be reunited with his father. The document was in English. He didn't understand it. By signing the papers, he was agreeing to deportation, and he was deported without seeing his son. The other thing is that a lot of our children, when we had found the child, the child's parent, and wanted to reunite them back then for a long time, the child first had to go before an immigration judge and request voluntary departure and get an order to voluntarily depart before the families could be reunited. These are the kind of things we were dealing with on a regular basis. Juan, I'm going to go to you with a question. I just want to sort of set the stage for the broader issues now, because the extent to which this administration has tried to erode immigrants' basic right to claim asylum is remarkable, to say the least. Our asylum system is being gutted. And let's remember that when people arrive at our border, whether they arrive legally or not, they're entitled to due process and to apply for asylum. So, Juan, let's bring in judges for a moment. I know that immigration judges have been very frustrated, to say the least, because they're required to close 700 cases a year if they want a good evaluation, etc. I know that former Attorney General Jeff Sessions was doing some things. Then we had the migrant protection protocols, which you can talk about. So can you just paint a picture for us about, if you're an asylum seeker in this country, how drastically things have changed?
It's become hell in a certain way, and part of it is, and I'd like to sort of almost place this in the context of what you all were facing, not just with the kids who were separated from their families, but you have to think of all the other work that was already pending, and what all the resources that were already stretched thinly to represent people in the asylum office, before CIS, before ICE, before the immigration court. And one of the reasons I mention these multiple agencies is because they don't schedule around the lawyer. They schedule as they like. They often will not communicate with you in a practical way. It's very much when we are told now, and this is as of January 20th, 2017, one of the lines that we regularly hear is there's a new sheriff in town. And so it went from people who were sort of just normally processing cases to a very much more serious law enforcement. We're here to sort of prevent people from staying here. And several of the things that that changed, one was the family separation. And you have to think of the problem that we face with the Attorney General, with Mr. Sessions, where he was not only an anti-immigration activist, but he had made sure that nationally, that a lot of national anti-immigration advocates or activists were inserted into the administration. So policies all of a sudden changed very harshly. The person who is in charge in CIS of the Ombudsman's office is someone, Ms. Kirshner, who was the executive director for Federation for American Immigration Reform, which is an anti-immigration group. So the person who's supposed to be helping you to solve problems with CIS is actually not for you.
Citizenship and Immigration Services.
I'm sorry, Citizenship and Immigration Service. So you have this problem where the Attorney General is not only an activist, but then you have to think that the Attorney General is the person who is also the head of the immigration courts. And one of the things that he did was that he started certifying cases. In other words, he would take them from the appellate body, which is referred to as the Board of Immigration Appeals, and so he would certify them to himself. And I'm going to give you two key examples of disastrous situations that we're facing now. There's a case called Matter of AB, which basically eliminates more than a decade and a half of work, almost 2 decades worth of work, on the issue of victims of domestic violence in countries where victims are not protected. And the question was that most of the victims were able before, in a very difficult way, because most people go unrepresented, they would be able to at least seek protection here, a country where we would respect people's rights. Now, what happened was that he certifies this case called Matter of AB to himself, and he says, no, private violence, private action is not something that relates to protection under the concept of refugee, and so we're going to do away with this. But then he inserts in this a prong in the fourth section, where he says, well, we can pretermit. In other words, an immigration judge can't, or the Board of Immigration Appeals can stop a case, can stop the presentation of a case if they find what they call a fatal flaw. Now, think of the story when you're hearing about children who are small, who do not understand law, who do not understand life, who are unable to express themselves, and then think of that in the context of adults, because most adults have no idea when you use language like pretermission, that means nothing to anyone who is not a specialist. And so one of the problems was that you had bunches and bunches of people who had applications pending, and it was one way of getting rid of getting rid of files. Because instead of hearing cases related to complex situations where you had cultural issues, where you had unrepresented individuals, where you had language issues, where you had the problem of legal mechanics, that you had all these people who were all of a sudden being cut off. To this day, you still have immigration judges who will not hear the entire case and say, oh no, your case is a domestic violence case, or your case is a gang-related case, we're done. And so they cut it off. And then I'm going to give you one of my favorite absurdities in the administration was that, for example, if you were kidnapped by a guerrilla group at any point and you were forced to work for this guerrilla group, whether it was one of the Guatemalan groups or one of the Salvadoran FMLN, then you, even though you had been kidnapped and involuntarily made, or you were made to serve this group, you were the equivalent of a terrorist. So you were a persecutor and you were pretermitted and you have no right to asylum. And so all of a sudden you see that, and you have to think of the power of the position of the Attorney General. The Attorney General not only runs the office of U.S. attorneys, in other words, they prosecute when they shouldn't have been prosecuting because this is a violation of refugee law. Then they also sit as, the Attorney General sits as a chief immigration judge above the chief immigration judge, and so was certifying things to himself. Then they also run the Bureau of Prisons, right? And so this is a problem because, by the way, they're also the marshal's office, so they also arrest you. So the question is, it's sort of like a psychotic situation where you have one person, one machine deciding to prosecute you criminally, deciding to also hear your case, but then also deciding that we're not going to hear your case, and then he seasons it a little bit more to make it even more difficult. And what he does is that they create this thing called dashboard and this quota, so that immigration judges have to complete about 700 cases. Now, as someone who does extraordinarily complex cases, because at the university we try to take extraordinarily complex cases, including the kids' cases, it's very difficult. And so if you're an immigration judge, and remember that an immigration judge is actually not what's referred to as an Article 3 judge, they're not independent federal judges. These are lawyers who work within the Department of Justice. They get to wear a robe and they get to call themselves judges. But what happens is that their performance is evaluated by their superiors, by the head, by the assistant chief immigration judge, or above them, the directors of the regional offices or of the national office. And so you will be dinged. In other words, your evaluation performance will go down if you are, at this point, if you're not completing the numbers that you need. And we have now seen master calendar hearings, which are the preliminary hearings, where they have 100 hearings in one day. If you add up eight hours a day and you divide it into the 8 hours and nobody really sits there for 8 hours, you will see that they spend less than 5 minutes per case. And so the question is, if you are cutting off from the very beginning and you're not giving people an opportunity, and Cheryl, you and I will recall the era when there was a case decided in the early 90s called Matter of Fifi that specifically said that you had to give an asylum applicant an opportunity to testify, because you never know. You never know because of PTSD, you never know because of culture, you never know because most of the time, people have no idea what it is that they're applying for. They think that they're applying for a work permit. They think that they're applying for an opportunity to receive protection, but they don't know the technicalities. So I'll give you this extra one. Just to finish off on the performance by the immigration judges, if you do not complete the case at the first merits hearing, you have a problem. So they will hold this against you as an immigration judge. If you continue the case, so you cannot, if you try to schedule a case to have a discussion to try to deal with children's issues, that goes against you because you need to resolve it at a preliminary hearing. And so the machine of deportation is geared up to not help these children, to not give them a fair hearing, and to then, even worse, to once you go on, one of the biggest problems that we all face is that the lack of representation. And you all do a great job of trying to represent people because it's simply, the numbers are astronomical in terms of people who are unrepresented.
And I'll just give you a quote from the former head of the National Association of Immigration Judges, Dana Marks, and this is what she said. Immigration judges hear death penalty cases in a traffic court setting. That's said from an immigration judge, and they're very frustrated that they're not independent. And the one thing I wanted to add was that a while back, not that long ago, our government decided that many asylum seekers are going to have to wait in Mexico after they've applied for asylum, wait in Mexico while their cases are pending, which raises another entire issue with respect to access to free attorneys or access to any attorneys, frankly. So Martha, my last question for you is, there's a couple of things. One is, how do you think our staff and our clients are coping in the aftermath of family separation? And how available is treatment in our community? And what would you recommend in terms of how to improve whatever lack of access there is?
Well, let's start from the second part. What are there services in our community to help children and adolescents to heal and better cope and continue their the milestones? No, there are no services. First, there is no funding. We have had some services in the past, and AAJ was a leader in finding these services or in helping these services to exist with the funding of the Children's Trust and the recognition that mental health is necessary in order for these kids to continue living normally. The second part, there's thousands of kids in our community. It's not only services for 100 kids, it's thousands of kids. Thousands of kids going to many public schools. If there are social work services in the schools, there is one social worker for 500 kids. In the schools, regarding what we learn in schools, I'm trying to put together like many ideas at the same time. There is very little recognition of immigrant kids, or there is still the literature and trauma literature and trauma research. It's starting to be acknowledged in the mental health schools. And the reality of family separation and immigrant kids, because there is no funding, there is no jobs, so it's like very clear that who is going to start these services. So these kids go to school, and I know from their own testimony that even though they are at times misbehaving or in school or having a depression crisis, social workers don't ask what's going on in your houses. And if they say that the father is going to be deported, they think that is one in I don't know how many, but it's a reality for many kids in our community. So we don't have services, unfortunately. And it's affecting, as I said before, the health, the behavior of kids, and their mental health. The health is clear because the amounts of cortisol and the production and segregation of stress hormones is affecting their whole system. Their mental health because they are depressed. Even if they are doing good in school, they are depressed. They have an extra pressure of trying to do their best in order to balance the stress that they experience at home, because their beloved father cannot sleep, and they know already that they cannot sleep, so there are no services. Services, what we need from those services? We need services that will address the whole family, or will educate the whole family on the effects of stress on children that are developing, and even on the adults, and how to develop healthy lives. But they are on survival mode, as far as I know. Most of these undocumented people that are under threat, they have to work 12 and 14 hours in order to bring some food to the tables. And now the kids are feeling guilty if they are not developing well in school because their parents have to work so hard. So what we recommend and what is necessary is to start small things. And that's what I do, visiting my clients, even if it's an evaluation for a child, hardship evaluation, how he will be affected by the deportation of the father. That one attorney that believes in this, because it's not that this is a privilege that I have, an AIJ is a privilege that believes that kids are affected in their mental health, but most attorneys will never send their children for an evaluation, for a mental health evaluation. So it has helped some of the cases that I have seen. And truly, what we have to also highlight of this population of Central American, we are talking of separation of Central America, is their resiliency and their openness to mental health services when they feel that they are understood. But if they go to a therapist and they are not understood, or it's not an interest, because we in our schools don't talk about that, or we are fearful of talking about that because then we immediately are triggered of what's going on with that kid affects us because we have kids, or because we see what the kids are suffering, and thinking about children is affects a lot of people, so prefer just to go backwards and not think about what's going on. So how is the staff affected? Well, all these changes.
How are we coping was my question.
How are we coping? Well, I think that every human being, is an adult, find ways of coping. Some ways will be really, I think that to be a trauma-informed organization, as AIJ is to create some avenues for attorneys to talk about how they are feeling, and to normalize that if you feel sad and depressed, it's normal. It's normal. So I have had the privilege to go and talk to some of the attorneys at AIJ, and how are they coping? They are very sad because it's normal to be sad. It's normal to be depressed. It's normal to cry after you hear a kid that is 3 years old and doesn't know what's his mom's name. But we, and especially attorneys, have been trained to be strong and to create, you cannot take your case with you. But it's impossible. You have decided to be an attorney of people that are vulnerable because you understand, and part of that understanding is having the sensitivity, because when you relate to a person, it's not a rational understanding, it's a heart-to-heart, which helps a lot of the clients, because when I have seen the clients trust them.
Thank you, Martha. That's a very important point because no matter whether a child has been separated or not, it can often take several interviews to build trust with them. I'm going to ask Michelle now about family detention and how that has impacted the children that we've seen. And I know that under a case that's a couple of decades old, Flores versus Reno, children are supposed to be kept in the least restrictive setting, not supposed to be in adult care custody for more than, I think, 20 days. What's the reality now on the ground?
Well, first, I think I just want to point out that when the family separation nightmare began, the administration's response was that that case and that settlement, the Flores settlement from 1997, that was the reason why they had to tear apart these families and why they could not detain these families together. But that's a lie. And Flores had nothing to do with this family separation. Flores has been around since 97, and we had never seen this ever happen before, and it doesn't mandate this, right? So what Flores does say is that a child has to be in the least restrictive setting, which means release to a family member, to a guardian, to another relative or a parent. And if that child cannot be released, that child must be not in a detention center, but in a licensed facility, a facility that's been licensed by a child welfare agency. And none of these family detention centers meet that criteria. So what should happen if a family is seeking asylum and passes their credible fear interview at the border is that if they're detained, it should be no longer than 20 days. And although the Obama administration vastly expanded family detention, ultimately due to court orders and other concerns, including the Flores case, they created a family case management program whereby families were released so that they could prepare their cases in a non-detained setting, and the children would not be detained in violation of Flores. And they were provided a caseworker that would help them understand the process, know their rights, help them find a place to live, and support them through this process. That case management program had a 99% success rate, meaning that they went to court, that they didn't abscond, that they went through the whole process. And the Trump administration very quickly canceled the case management system and are continuing to promote and propose the idea that the Flores settlement should be canceled by statute, and that we should create laws that allow the American government to indefinitely detain families as they go through this process. So we're talking, could be years, right? They're also proposing to change the protections that unaccompanied children have. So the Trafficking Victims Protection Act does a whole host of things for different vulnerable populations. But the majority of protections for unaccompanied minors reside in that Trafficking Victims Protection Act, which requires a standard of care and also provides them certain benefits, like applying for asylum before an asylum officer instead of in front of a judge with a government lawyer fighting against them. This administration is proposing that we do away with those protections and that we get rid of essentially the definition of what an unaccompanied minor is. And that we also be allowed to deport them by themselves when we apprehend them at the border. So unaccompanied children they're under the TVPA cannot be summarily deported without a hearing at the border, right? They must be provided shelter and the opportunity to present their case before the asylum office. And the combination of the expansion of family detention as well as the decimation of unaccompanied children's rights is their goal and what they've been trying to accomplish. And I think the family separation was them trying to do it without authorization and without any legal basis.
Right after the day after the administration said we're going to end family separation, they went into federal court and asked for permission to basically bypass the Flores decision and keep children in adult detention for as long as they wanted. Last question, and that's for you, Juan, and then we're going to open up to questions from all of you. So last time I checked, there were over 10,000 pending children's cases in Miami Immigration Court where they had no attorney. My question for you, what's the impact and what, if anything, can be done?
It's a major problem because the situation is that if we think of the family cases and there you have the post and or the end of the family separation cases, and then now the family cases are supposed to be a priority. Well, this is a major problem because, of course, there aren't enough lawyers to represent these individuals, to represent these families, and so the judges are moving these along, and the problem with moving these cases along is what do you do? Because you have very few organizations. AIJ is one of the two main organizations here in South Florida that actually is able to provide representation. Otherwise, you have law students and you have pro bono attorneys, and realistically, you have very slim representation. That pressure with the machine of the Department of Justice and the Department of Homeland Security saying we need to move these cases along. I'll give you this. Immigration judges will hear cases and the government will say, we don't even have our file. And the judges will say, it's okay, you don't need your file. Because it's already so unfair that you can just sit there and we will move this case along and we don't have to worry. And so there could be information in that alien file. There could be information on anything that might have been said, a document that might have been turned over by a parent. There's no need for it because the point is move numbers along. And we will see horrible consequences to this because then you have a Board of Immigration Appeals that is also moving things along, and you have an attempt to fill the immigration courts with judges who will comply with a number system. And so these thousands of individuals are not going to face justice. They're going to face a machine that moves them along. And if you think of the compliance system, one of the problems is that a lot of these families are expected to report to this processing center called in Miramar. ICE has an office where children and adults will stand outside for hours waiting to report in. Parent might have a monitor on their leg, and the question is, they're being given information like, we need your passport because we want to be ready. And the answer is, well, you haven't even heard the case yet, and you're already planning my removal. And so it's an environment that's hostile, it's an environment that's inhumane, and it's an environment that needs to be challenged consistently in the district courts, understanding that if you think of Flores, there are two decisions that are very scary from the Supreme Court. Last year, and these are both Justice Alito decisions, there's the Jennings decisions that talks about indefinite detention in certain circumstances, not in the case of unaccompanied minors. But then the most recent case, the Preet decision, which is also another bad decision because it talks about that, well, detention is okay. We can hold people as long as we need to. And so how will that filter down into the world of unaccompanied minors?
And I think what Juan has just made clear, and Martha and Michelle, is that the cards are really stacked against these children. You can be a toddler and you have no right to a free attorney. In our immigration system, immigration law is extremely complex. It's been compared to our tax system. It's archaic, it's complicated, there are many moving parts. Before I open it to questions, just a few closing remarks. The trauma lingers. Just because family separation has quote unquote ended doesn't mean that the trauma has ended. And the work on the legal cases has not ended. And that could go on for years. One of the things that a lot of people aren't aware of when people say you have to come at a legal port of entry, there's something that I think I mentioned in the report called metering. And what that is Border Patrol limits the number of daily cases that they're going to process. And so obviously there are waiting lists. Last time I checked in one town in Mexico, there were 3,300 cases pending. The other thing is the push versus the pull. Is there abject poverty in El Salvador, Guatemala, and El Salvador? Honduras, Guatemala, and El Salvador? Absolutely. But there's also extreme gang violence and terrible, vicious drug cartels. And they target these kids, and they target families. And I will just quote for you something that Jay Johnson, who was the DHS secretary under Obama, said just yesterday. He said, what these families are doing is making a decision to flee a burning building. They feel they have no choice. The only way to save themselves and their children is to flee, and they're very aware, in most cases, of how dangerous that journey is going to be. If you go to our State Department website and you go to Honduras, Guatemala, El Salvador, and see what they say, one of the things they say is that they've been giving money to these countries to make them safer because there's so much uncontrolled violence there. Our current system is ill-prepared for the arrival of children and families. For many, many years, it was Mexican men arriving alone seeking work. So now when these children arrive at the border, families arrive at the border, they're being held in these cages or these hieleras for far more than the 72 hours that they're required to be held. Now, to his credit, I heard the head of CBP not long ago say, we know, this was after 2 young children died around the holidays, we know we're not equipped to do this. We've got to do better. We've got to make changes. So the last thing I'll say is, you know, in recent weeks we learned that thousands more families than our government has acknowledged have been separated. I think they acknowledged something like 2,800 families have been separated. Now many, many more, because they weren't including families where the parents had already been deported, or the cases before the zero tolerance policy. And the judge in the ACLU case on family separation said that those families should be part of his class action lawsuit. Now, federal courts, I want to leave on a positive note. Federal courts have done a great job of pushing back with respect to the immigration issue and, frankly, a number of other issues. And thank goodness we have the federal courts to turn to. We have several cases pending where we're in federal court challenging issues. So despite everything you've heard here, and I can tell you, I've been doing this for a long time, and I never imagined not just family separation, but the extent to which our basic rights, the right to apply for asylum in the United States of America, is being taken away at lightning speed. But I am hopeful. I am hopeful for change. Agencies like ours need to work harder than ever. People like Juan and the students that he teaches are learning about what's really going on. People like Martha are providing the much needed services. And I believe that sooner rather than later, whatever that means, that we will see our country once again welcoming refugees. Understanding the rule of law is critical in this country. It's what separates us from so many other countries that we complain about, and that people will once again, you know, have a fair opportunity to make their case in court, and that those who are entitled to relief get it. So now, questions, please, because we know there's a lot going on, and I had more questions, but we didn't have time for them, because there's been a lot of breaking news lately on immigration, including we've got to take away the money from the Northern Triangle countries. You know, we've reached the breaking point. We've got to close the border. So you've got a great panel here. Are there any questions? Okay.
Hello,
Hi.
I'm Eric Kamait, professor here at FIU.
Oh, yes. Hi.
How are you, Cheryl? I just had a couple of quick comments and then a question. Sometimes we pretend that history just started yesterday with the caravan. Actually, it started in 1904 with the United Fruit Company, followed by gunboat diplomacy, followed by the genocide in the 1980s, and then the exportation of gangs to Central America. So, you know, we need to own the fact that we've created the situation, number one. Number two, I just wanted to comment that the unaccompanied minor crisis started almost a decade ago or more. In 2009, there were 7,300 unaccompanied minors in ICE detention. The next year, 2010, there were 9,400. The next year, there were 11,700, then so on, 15,000, and then it kind of leveled off. And then we had the crisis of 21,000 coming in during the Obama administration. So it's something that has been a systemic problem that has not been addressed. The question is the following. I feel that, immigration lawyers and advocates, me included, we just go around trying to put Band-Aids on a sinking ship, trying to remedy terrible situations. And I haven't seen an attack on the core issue, which to my mind is the blatant unconstitutionality of the mandatory detention clause of IRIRA 1996. Basically, we have been in a process of criminalization of migration. Entering the country used to be and still is just an administrative infraction. It's not a criminal offense. But we've found ways of finagling about it so that then the crime is not reporting to an immigration officer or lying to an immigration officer or peripheral things that are designed to criminalize migrants, right? So then the problem is that they come in front of federal court, usually in Operation Streamline procedures like they have all along the border, particularly in Tucson, the federal court in Tucson, Arizona. And so once they're there, they're facing an immigration detainer. So there's no bail hearing, which happens to be the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, the right to reasonable bail, or at least to a hearing. So judges, since there's this mandatory detention and this detainer a priori from Immigration and Customs Enforcement, they deny wholesale defendants in federal court the 8th Amendment of the Constitution, among many other rights guaranteed by our Bill of Rights. So I just wanted to see what your thoughts are about the possibility of just attacking the very constitutionality of this rule.
Juan?
The issue is there are so many constitutional issues to raise, and there are so few lawyers. And if there's one thing that we've discovered over the years is that you have to deal with immigration at different levels. In terms of, can you hear me?
Here.
In terms of immigration, I'll give you a comparison. You heard I mention both Jennings and Preet. There's this whole problem of you have the constitutional issue of should this person have a bond hearing? Should there be a review of their custody? We're talking about roulette. We're talking about some judges will issue a release on their own recognizance. Some people will parole you. In other words, not the judge, but the ICE officer. Here in Miami, if you're at the Chrome Detention Center and have a criminal history, you're more likely to get a reasonable bond from some of the judges compared to the Broward Transition Center. So realistically, there's an element of roulette involved. And then you have to be careful what cases you bring up, because the question is, there are cases that are brought in certain circuits that are brought brought by some national organizations. But the thing is that organizations like American for Immigrant Justice try to both litigate, advocate, and represent. And the problem is that there are so many people who are willing to discuss these, but then don't do what American Immigrant Justice does. In other words, taking on these cases that realistically take extraordinary amounts of energy, of resources. And so even when the funding is out, you're still there helping that child. You're still there helping that family. And so people think, oh, that case is just a custody redetermination. No. So assuming that we were, and I can tell you that right now in the American Immigration Lawyers Association, we have a joke that there are almost 30 issues, 30 constitutional issues that could be brought to district court. Again, what if you end up before a judge who is going to only create worse law? What if you, in the process of helping, cause more damage? And you have to be very careful, because the other part is the resources that are required. If you have litigation, you need to prepare to deal with motions and with discovery and the nightmare of the big machine of the Department of Justice going against you. And so sometimes you have to persuade individual lawyers, listen, it's not a good idea to bring that, because right now, if you bring that to the district court, you're just going to be overwhelmed. You don't even have the resources to write, and you try to build the teams to do this. Since January of 2017, it's just escalated to a different level, so that now it's a 7-day-a-week problem. Now you get decisions on Saturday evening. It used to be that they would process cases and they would notify you, oh, you can come pick up this person. No, now you're getting denials of stays of removal on a Saturday at 5 or 6 o'clock. And the question is, so you have these different levels that you have to deal with, understanding that there are these massive constitutional issues, but the question is, realistically, how much more can an organization stretch in what it already does, understanding that the demand in each area of service is extraordinary. You have VAWA, you have trafficking, and then we forgot to mention the special immigrant juvenile programs that involves its own level of complexity at the state court level, and the resources that it takes to appeal those type of issues. So it's a multi-front war, and it's a war on immigrants, and very much the bigger machine is on the other side.
Let me just say that the report that we finished about a year and a half after the election is called Building the Wall, a New War on Immigrants. Any other questions? Yes. Wait, sorry. Okay. Go ahead.
Thanks, everybody, for being here. How many children throughout the United States are being sent to foster care, and what is that doing to our economy and furthering the trauma of a child?
Well, I really don't know the statistic. This is working, I think. I really don't know how many. I know that there are thousands or hundreds of thousands of kids in the foster care system. But the baseline is separation. You know, a child was born with a right to have a family or a good caregiver who would support them. It's not happening in our American system, because I heard the director of, what's her name, Christine Nell?
Department of Homeland Security.
That's what we do here. So separate families with a smile in her face in Congress. He said that's what we do here. We separate families, and if the father or the mother, the parents are against the law, have done something against the law, they have to be separated. Well, separation from the family leaves a child with a void inside themselves, because trauma is not about the story. It's about the imprinting of that fear and that helplessness in a young body, and a body that is. So I don't know if this answered your question, but that's what needs to be fixed, not to separate more kids. And in the foster care system, to educate families on how to resolve conflict and not to separate. This is something that through the National Association of Social Workers I have talked a lot, but it doesn't have like a lot of resonance, because we are mandated to report, and I don't know, and that's not helping. So,
A couple more. Oh, I'm sorry. I thought you were done.
so the basic thing is separating kids. Kids need their parents and a good caregiver in order to continue their life paths and not to be producing all these stress hormones that are affecting their system. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Other questions? One here.
Yeah, sure. So I was obviously the vast majority of these family separation cases have happened along the southwest U.S.-Mexico border. I was curious, have you encountered any other cases, for instance, of, say, Venezuelans coming to Miami or Haitians, for instance, coming into sort of different ports of entry that have also experienced family separation?
Yeah, I think my mic's working. Yeah, we have heard reports of cases where families have entered, Venezuelan families, for example, have entered through with a valid tourist visa at the Miami International Airport, and the customs officers don't believe that they're going to be here for tourism purposes and believe that they're likely to stay here to seek asylum. And once the Customs and Border Protection has made that determination, they have separated these families. And so we've seen it in different ways. So the father could be detained at our transitional center, and then the mother and the children are released. But we had also seen actual family separation where the children have been removed from the parents. And we talk about this all the time. This family separation crisis from the summer was really horrific in the way that it all manifested itself. But we see family separation every single day, right? We see parents who have lived here for 20 years with multiple American citizen children and no criminal record being picked up and detained and sometimes permanently separated from their children when they're deported.
Sorry, there and then there. Oh, 1, 2, and 3.
Hi, thank you. My name is Jamie Nolan. I work with City Year. It's an educational nonprofit where we work within Miami-Dade Public Schools. And my question is specifically for Martha. I really was interested when you were talking about with students from like Guatemala coming in and not speaking a dialect of Spanish and being able to communicate with them. We have students who we can't necessarily communicate verbally with them because we don't speak the same language, and they could be here legally, they could be here illegally. We don't have much information on them. What can we do in the school system at that level to help, even if they're here legally with that trauma of just the transition coming into this American culture? What can we do to help that?
I think this is working. Truly, at this moment, the school system should work on that, and facilitate the process of acculturation, but because that's a right that a child has to be heard and to have someone to listen to them. My experience with Guatemalan kids is that they learn very fast, the English and the Spanish. And this is my experience with a kid that I saw once many years ago, and since then I have seen it forever. With many Guatemalan kids, I saw him one day. He didn't speak English nor Spanish. And the next week, he was able to express himself. So it's about looking. If all policies will be developed from a strength-based perspective, situation will be much easier. And so it's a right of a child. I don't know if I answered your question. It's a right of a child. And there is a lot in this Guatemalan that maybe it's genetic because they are very intelligent, because they come from a culture that was highly developed. And they are very disciplined, so they learn fast. They are dedicated to what they are dedicated. The thing is that if there's no safety and they are discriminated, the fight or flight mechanism inside of them, what is making, and I'm saying this from the community of Homestead, where most kids don't go to school because they don't feel welcome.
There was another question here, and I think there was another question there.
Hi, I'm Maria Pinheiro. I'm a journalism student here at FIU, and my question is for Juan. Last year, I was an interpreter at the Citizenship and Immigration Services for asylum seekers, and oftentimes I would listen to the stories of other interpreters about how their clients were often deported right then and there before even getting the chance to have their interview and present their case, and having already started their immigration proceedings. So my question is this legally justified? And if not, how are they doing it and why?
No, there is a process, and the problem is, though, that there have been individuals who have been picked up and detained in the asylum office or at CIS or at Citizenship and Immigration Service. But no, I mean, the problem is that sometimes you'll run into individuals who might have had an immigration history, which again is the importance of having an attorney. Because if you have an attorney and the person is able, after several conversations, to have a trusting conversation, and so the person can tell you what their story was. Maybe they were ordered removed in some at the border. In their removal case, they didn't even understand that they were in removal. You can't imagine the number of times that people will hand me papers and they go, see, they gave me permission to be here in the U.S. And the answer is no. That's an accusation. That's a notice to appear saying that you had to appear in immigration court. And when you check the number for the court and you realize, oh my dear God, this person not only has a different A number, but this person has a different history. And without someone to actually do the practical things or someone to actually help them, then that's where you get these problems. One of the big problems with the asylum office is that you have people who are being not being represented, but who are being helped in theory to prepare their asylum claims. And the problem is that people don't always tell the story that is their story. You have many times people persuaded or told, no, this is what works. When you have a perfectly good claim, and yet the problem is that there are a lot of immigration preparers and other people out there who are writing nonsense and who are doing a disservice to the Central Americans seeking asylum, but also to Venezuelans seeking asylum. We've seen it with Haitians, where people are misled and told this is what you have to say, as opposed to what they should be actually telling, because they're being misadvised.
Whenever there's so much noise around immigration, these unscrupulous notorios crawl out of the woodwork. And in many home countries of immigrants here, notaries are attorneys. And so people in good faith give them their last dime, and instead of helping them, they're put in harm's way. I also want to mention that under Obama, roughly 1 million people who weren't priorities for removal, with good reason, were able to check in with an immigration officer every year and told, okay, you're good for another year, able to renew their work permit. Now, when those people go to the office here to check in, guess what? If you don't have an attorney, chances are you're in handcuffs, you're in detention, and you're about to be removed. And that's the reality. Yeah, there were a couple more questions. No, go ahead.
Thank you all for your very important work. Frankly, I don't know how any of you sleep. It just sounds like you could use some help, and I was wondering if you had ideas about, if people are attorneys or law students, how they could help. If you're a mental health professional, how you could be of help, and really just how sort of citizens could be of help.
So specific to our organization, we have volunteer attorneys, volunteer law students all the time, and we welcome all the help that we can get. Sometimes that means helping with screening, providing legal screenings to these children at the shelters, and other times it means taking on a full-blown asylum case if possible. We also have opportunities for individuals to help us translate documents. There's a lot of paperwork and a lot of translation of birth certificates and other documents from the home country that often pile up and we need help with. So there are plenty of ways to volunteer, and I believe the volunteers sign up is still on our website. Okay, thank you.
Oh, and we have reports. The family separation report is on a table there at the back.
In terms of volunteering, that one of the important things is you must not let this pass in silence.
Yeah.
In the 80s and the 90s, silence, it was in the AIDS epidemic, silence was death. And today, silence is just complicity in what is being done by this administration. And we cannot let it just go by. And one thing is, people think that people like those of us here at this panel, that, like, like we're out there telling people, and you'd be surprised the hatred that you encounter, and that hatred must be confronted. So just tell the stories. Go in, and if you see people being bullied, if you see people who just don't have, let the word continue to be passed on that something wrong is going on here. And by the way, this is first step in endangering civil liberties. Because if you think that this is going to just be on immigrants, no. Every vulnerable population in this country will face the hatred that comes from the machines that have pushed this agenda.
Yes? Oh, I'm sorry. Oh, you're in charge, okay, great.
As a practical standpoint, if you're an immigration attorney, how do you represent a minor in their claim for relief, whether it's asylum or something else, when they can't even identify their parent's name or hometown or anything else?
It's a great question. That's something that we really, really struggled with. Sometimes our legal strategy for the very small children, where like the 3-year-old, was just to beg the judge to close the case, right? The judge didn't even know what to do with a lot of these children that were very small, right? We had lawyers carrying children into the courtroom and putting them on the chair. And so our first strategy was to just get the judge to close the case and argue that the government had no basis to prosecute this child in this way, and that even the government attorney had no information about the true identity of this child, right? In some cases that was successful. In cases where we don't have any information, we can't apply for asylum, right? There's no basis. In cases where the children have a parent who has been deported and the parent does not want that child to return to the home country, there's an option for special immigrant juvenile status, like Juan mentioned before. It's very complex and actually very hard to win in the state of Florida. There are other states that are much more friendly to it. And then in some cases, we have been able to gather information and evidence from other family members who can tell us the horrors that the family suffered in the home country. And essentially you put together the case not in the voice of the child or with evidence provided by the child, but evidence provided by family members.
Hi, I'm with the AP. I'm a reporter. I wanted to ask what you have heard, Michelle, and I guess Cheryl too, from judges on the aspect of Flores being sort of requiring the least restrictive settings and the 20-day rule when it comes to unaccompanied children, because part of the literature that these, I guess, companies and shelters have is the average number of days that the children are spending is really high. Is, at one point like 67, 72 days. So it's not 20 days at all. And this is like, public. They put it out. It's information that anyone can get. And also, what are you hearing now from sponsors if you are helping these children